Okay. And everyone's going to join on, so just like give it 30 seconds, like 20 seconds. Okay, so we have everyone in from the waiting room. So Eli, if you would like to start.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Kathleen. Welcome everyone to the first ever World Parkinson Coalition Partner Highlight. My name is Eli Pollard. I'm the Executive Director of the World Parkinson Coalition. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit organization based in the US, and every 3 years we host the World Parkinson Congress, a very unique meeting that brings the global community together, including scientists, clinicians, people with Parkinson's, family members, and others. And we are thrilled to launch this new series of talks with different members of our coalition, starting with Parkinson Canada. Today, Parkinson Canada will be sharing with all of us some interesting work that they've been doing on a program called the Canadian Open Parkinson Network. And with us today, we have the CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Parkinson Canada, Karen Lee. And we have a few other panelists. I'm going to let Karen introduce the panelists and get us underway. Thank you so much, Karen and Parkinson Canada, for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Eli, and thank you to your new team for basically featuring Parkinson Canada and the wonderful work that has been ongoing. I wanted to, first of all, thank you all for joining us and to offer you all that this panel discussion is focused on Canadian Open Parkinson Network, or known as C-OPN. More than 25 people in Canada are diagnosed with Parkinson's every day. In just 10 years, that number will double to more than 50 each day. With 100,000 people in Canada living with Parkinson's and rising drastically, we need to make investments now to accelerate Parkinson's research with the goal of finding new treatments and ultimately a cure. Parkinson Canada, along with Brain Canada, is proud to be a founding partner of C-OPN. What is C-OPN, I think, is what people are starting to ask us. Well, C-OPN is looking to collect data and information, including biological samples and brain images from people living with Parkinson's. C-OPN has a mission with all the data collected to unite research efforts to understand and treat Parkinson's disease. C-OPN is all about stakeholders coming together to accelerate Parkinson research. People with Parkinson's can support and take part in research. Researchers and clinicians can also collaborate and work on solving the unanswered questions about Parkinson's. And community partners can make investments in growing this network. The goal of today's panel's discussion is to share more about what C-OPN is and the impact we hope it will have. We will have the opportunity for participants to ask questions in the last 10 minutes of this hour. So please do type your questions in the chat box below if you do have one, and we will try our best to answer certain questions. Joining us today, we have 3 leading Canadian researchers who are part of C-OPN. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jon Stoessl. He's the immediate past president of World Parkinson Coalition, and he is also a board member and a C-OPN principal investigator and researcher. We have Dr. Oury Monchi. He's the co-director and also principal investigator with C-OPN. And as well, we have Dr. Edward Faun, the co-director and principal investigator with C-OPN. So with that, I'm going to open the floor to the 3 of them. And I would love if the 3 of you could each briefly describe yourself, the role you play in C-OPN, and why you chose to be involved. So first, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Stoessl.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Eli and Kathleen. So I'm a neurologist at University of British Columbia. I've had a long history with a variety of Parkinson organizations, including Parkinsons Canada. Was previously for many years on their scientific board and then chaired the Scientific Advisory Board, a role that was then taken over by Ted Faun, who's also on today's call. And as Karen mentioned, I've had a long history with the World Parkinson Coalition. So the main reason that I got involved is because Oury and Ted told me to. They had a long history, well, a short, somewhat short, I guess, history of success in Quebec, where in the province of Quebec, they and a group of their colleagues were able to convince the government that Parkinson's research could move forward much more quickly if people worked in collaboration and collected information in a cooperative fashion. And historically, that's not always the way that science has been done for a variety of reasons that we can discuss. So they convinced me that this was a good thing to do. And I think the critical issue that we may talk about in more detail later is that certain types of questions can only be addressed when you have large data sets. So historically, science has been done in a more hypothesis-driven fashion where you have an idea, you set out to test it, and then you collect the data. And historically, that's often been done with relatively small data sets. But some types of questions you really can't adequately address that way. Geneticists have understood that for a lot longer than many other areas. Nowadays, you need data sets that are numbered in the thousands or actually hundreds of thousands to draw firm conclusions. And there are all kinds of questions out there that are relevant to Parkinson's where we would benefit by pooling our data, and I'd be happy to discuss examples of what some of those might be later, but I think it might be time to move on to my colleagues.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Dr. Monchi.
Yes, hello. Well, thank you, Karen, Ellie, for organizing this, and all of you for coming. So, well, as Jon already said, well, so I've done the first part of my career in Montreal. I'm a researcher with an emphasis on brain imaging and non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease. And about in 2012 or so, Ted and I and other researchers from Quebec were meeting regularly, in part to optimize how data would be collected and how we would solicit movement disorders neurologists to recruit patients for research. And we thought that it would be much more useful if we were able to centralize the process and to share our data. And eventually we were able to, indeed, as Jon said, convince the Quebec government to fund the Quebec Parkinson Network, which Ted has led excellently ever since. And we had discussed with various of our colleagues throughout Canada, including Jon, the possibility of having a similar model. And we were fortunate recently that Parkinsons Canada and Brain Canada partnered for us to do so. And we've now started this process, and we're all encouraged to register via our website. And we're happy to get it started, and I'll explain a bit more about how all this works during today's talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Manchi. Dr. Faun, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about why you're involved? And just need to unmute. Be able to unmute.
There we go.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm having all kinds of Zoom issues. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Eli and Karen, for giving us this opportunity. And also, of course, Parkinsons Canada, who've really been spearheading this initiative now for probably about 4 years since we first had discussions with Parkinson Canada and Brain Canada. So my name is Faun. I'm currently a neurologist and scientist at the Montreal Neurological Institute at McGill University, where I'm also the scientific director of the institute. And like John, I've had a long association with Parkinsons Canada. I also spent a number of years as the chair of the scientific board. And I think this initiative is really fantastic. And I think it's going to take I think it's going to take Parkinsons Canada to the next level. I'm really excited about it. As John and Oury mentioned, this really came out of the idea that science really progresses when people work together, and especially, there are certain types of studies and certain types of research that can best be done with large data sets, and also data that involves not only the scientists in their labs, but also the clinicians and the patients themselves. And so having the patients participate in this, I think, is really novel. And I think the World Parkinson's Congress has also been a big champion of that concept. So what we've done, this started in Quebec, as Oury and John mentioned. We lobbied Quebec government, the Fonds de Recherche Québec Santé, to fund us, and built now over 6 years ago the Quebec Parkinson Network. And the idea is to bring patients, researchers, and clinicians together. And in that short time, and to be honest, on a relatively modest budget, in the Quebec Parkinson Network, we've built a cohort of patients through 4 centers in Quebec of over 1,500 patients, and collected not only information on these patients, but also imaging and biosamples. And I think one of the reasons this is so important and so exciting is that, as John said, it's important for genetics, but I think right now we're really at the start of a real change, a revolution in the way science is done. And the ability to take patient samples, just take a blood sample, and then be able to reprogram cells from blood and turn them into different types of brain cells, and even make 3-dimensional brain organoids, and model diseases and test new treatments on the actual patient sample, is something that's really new. And I think an initiative like C-OPN is really important to be able to get large numbers of patients involved in that kind of research, and to correlate that kind of the findings with imaging as well. Is critical. And if everyone does that at the scale of their own labs, then we're talking about, dozens or a few patients. But if we do that at the level of a country, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of patients, and the power of that is really immense. So I think I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you. I think you all did, actually answered my first question, which was really about what the excitement is and the opportunity of C-OPN. And I'm hearing a lot about the importance of collaboration, having people impacted by Parkinson's be involved with the research, and collecting a lot of data, which is really critical. The one part that John talked about, which was that there's only certain questions that you can answer by pooling a lot of data together. And I would love to ask each of you really quickly, if you could, what would be the one question you would like have answered through C-OPN by collecting all that data? So I'm going to give it to John, because he was the one who actually brought it up first. So I'm going to pass it to John, please.
I didn't say that there would be one question. I think, there are many. One would be cause, and that obviously genetics plays a role in that. I think also the relationship between genetics and imaging are things that can only be addressed with large data sets. But I think crucially, things like, is there a relationship between certain factors and certain outcomes? Because we all know that people with Parkinson's Some people do very well, some people do poorly, and many people are somewhere in between. If you propose that there are certain factors that may predict a certain trajectory, and secondarily then, if you propose that you can do something to have an impact on that trajectory, the only way you're really going to be able to address that is with large data set. And if I can, I talked before about the traditional hypothesis-driven approach to science. When you collect large data sets and registries, it's not the hypothesis generation also takes on a different form. It's not that you don't have a hypothesis, but it's that the nature of the hypothesis changes. So instead of saying, I predict that A will lead to B, you now may say, I predict that A, B, C, D, and E may have an impact on Z, and here's how I'm going to look for it. But the other critical thing is, there are some things that we cannot predict. And if I could use a current example, which is COVID, we don't actually know what impact COVID may have on Parkinson's, whether certain drugs used to treat Parkinson's may have an impact on COVID infection, whether COVID infection could even lead to Parkinson's down the road. If you have a registry where you're able to look at people where you're already set up to go, you can answer some of those questions with relative ease, which would otherwise take an enormous amount of effort to get off the ground.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Jon.
So that was only four things. I'll come back with the other 23 later.
We could do it in the Q&A. Oury, could you maybe talk a little bit about what question you think would be answered or what you would like to see answered by pooling data together?
I think what's important to me is not necessarily, once again, a specific question, but the fact that we can address heterogeneity much faster if you have big pools. Because one of the problems is, indeed, we want to study about famous factors that Jon were talking about, but sometimes you're looking for factors that have a strong influence, but are not necessarily there in the majority of patients.
Mm-hmm.
So in one given center, you might have, very few patients that respond to those criteria. And it's only by pooling the data that you can address these heterogeneity. May they be genetic or specific clinical manifestations.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the important things that such a network can address.
And I think, does that really speak to that whole idea that the disease, Parkinson's disease, is very personal. It's that not everyone progresses or goes the same way. And by pooling that, hopefully, not that you're going to be exactly the same as the other person across the country, but that will give you a better sense because not everyone's the same, correct? Okay.
Correct. Well, you can know quickly with a database what is shared amongst the different patients and what's not.
Excellent.
And of course, I think something that Jon addressed when he said that big data set allow you to study whether A, B, C, D, and C contribute to Z. This has been, in the last 10 years, this has really been developed by progress that has been done in novel statistical analysis methods such as machine learning and deep neural networks, which allow to deal with the many parameters at the same time to see how they contribute. And indeed, the questions, the hypotheses are changed. They become much more complex, but also much more informative.
Great, thank you. Dr. Faun, I know, you've talked about you've already started this in Quebec and had a very successful program prior to C-OPN being launched, across the country. Were there very specific questions you guys have already been able to answer through the Quebec cohort and future looking? What are you hoping would be addressed as well?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And I think that the answer is certainly we've started to address some, I think, really critical questions through the Quebec Parkinson Network. Just to give you an idea, we've supported over 80 studies, and so this means that what we're trying to do is connect or match scientists with patients. Often you have researchers that have a study, they have a question they want to answer, and because they're not neurologists, they're not clinicians, they can't address that, they can't access the patients easily. And on the other hand, you have patients who are just saying like, look, I want to be part of research. I have this terrible disease and I want to make a difference. I want to participate in the research. And one of the areas where I think we've had an impact, and where I think C-OPN will have a similar impact, is that we've become a kind of a matching service or a dating service where we connect patients with researchers that are looking for patients for their studies. So a kind of Uber or Tinder of Parkinson's research, where we're matching people. And just doing that, we've supported over 80 studies since the inception. So I think, and it speaks to what Jon and Oury are saying, is that you can only do that if you have a large network and a pool of patients that are interested and want to be part and participate, active participants in research. So I think that's one area and one, I guess, model that I think has really worked well beyond my expectations, to be honest. I wasn't, I was not as optimistic when we started this, that this would work as well as it has. So I think connecting patients with the researchers accelerates research and gives and provides answers to those researchers, published studies from that kind of matching service or matching connection that we're bringing about in the community, in the research and the patient community. So I think, yes, that's one area. The other is, just building the cohort. To me, again, coming back to this question of, not all Parkinson's is the same. And I guess the fancy word for that is, trying to stratify Parkinson's, come up with groups of patients that have similar features. And the reason to do that is not just because it's interesting, but because the prediction is that patients that are similar will respond to the same therapy. Mm-hmm. And so stratification, I think, is very important. And of course, if you only have like 50 patients, then stratification is not really possible. But so you need large numbers of patients to start to see patterns emerge, where you can see subsets. Oh, look at this group of patients. They're behaving this way. They're responding this way to medication. And I think this is very timely, because there's been really some advances in biology now where, we hear the word personalized medicine a lot. In Parkinson's, just very small hands. Some patients respond well, some don't. And I think there's no real way to test in advance or to personalize the therapy of a given patient. And the ability, what I was mentioning a bit earlier now, is that we can now derive and make cell models of and small brain models that are personalized from a given patient, and then test therapies in the dish, in the lab, and see if the patient's neurons or organoids, mini brains, respond to a certain therapy. And you can test thousands and thousands of prospective or drugs, possible drugs, and see if they work on a given patient. And again, the word is stratification, where perhaps, if you did a clinical trial and gave the drug to everyone, it might fail. But if you did a test in the dish where you saw that of, several hundred neurons, 10% of those responded, you can then go back to the clinic and test and go back and only try the drug in those 10% patients. And you might have a very, an amazing success. So I think, again, the power of these networks is that you can have the numbers to do these kinds of experiments. And I think that's where we're really going to see an effect. Just like, and I think the same goes for imaging, where you can, start to see subsets and different stratify patients. And that's really the key for me.
Well, and I think that's really exciting when we hear about, we're talking about treatments, right? And currently there are no disease modifying therapies for people living with Parkinson's. So the ability to test out things quickly in a personalized way, I think is a very exciting piece for people living with Parkinson's, to understand that potentially there could be medication or treatments that's designed specifically for what you are going through. And so thinking about that and how people can participate and be part of research. And, you know, we all understand research provides hope, but I would love to understand from all of you and for everyone in the audience really, is what does it mean to truly participate, to be part of C-OPN? What does that mean? What will it take? And, you know, is it a lot of time? If you could, each of you touch upon, and maybe Oury first, if you could talk about, for someone to be involved, what does that mean?
So there's two different ways. The one way is to just register via the website and put minimal information, so that you'll be contacted by the closest site to where you live. And we hope that in the future we'll be able to grow and have more sites added. We currently have 8 in 4 different provinces, including Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. And we're hoping to grow eventually to include more of the centers. Another way is that you may have in the past already met with some of your clinics, or you got involved in research, and you may be contacted via the sites themselves directly. So for the time being, what it will involve is filling questionnaires about your health, about various demographics, some clinical information that some of it will also be collected from your clinician, and also information about cognition, neuropsychiatric symptoms, and so on. And of course, we have been, as you can all imagine, we have been a bit slowed down by COVID-19, because there's also a part which involves the participant going to the site, notably to get blood samples for genetic information, and also to generate the cells that Dr. Faun was talking about. And eventually the goal of this is that you may be, if you're interested, you'll be called to take part in other studies that actually, so we've had already a few people who were planning national studies who've contacted Ted and I asking, you know, will we be able to recruit from the multiple sites? And this strengthens their proposal when they're looking for money for their studies.
Okay, so that's great. So I think, so basically there's 2 ways. Just easily you can register, which I think we will provide the website as a follow-up. And then over time, depending on what you're providing in terms of data, you may be contacted, and then the whole matching, or the Tinder as we call it, will come to play. So I think that's a really exciting piece. And the first step is really to register, is really what we are asking of participants, specifically here in Canada. One of the things that we know is so important in terms of living with Parkinson's is our care partners. They are really part of, you know, Parkinson's is a family disease. So can care partners participate in C-OPN? And if so, how? Would someone like to touch upon that? I don't know, Jon or Ted?
So I believe that right now the participation is really, the recruitment into the study is really for people with Parkinson's rather than the care partners, but certain types of information may require care partner input, and that's obviously an important part of the equation on an ongoing basis. But I'm pretty sure that right now the initial information is coming strictly from people with Parkinson's. It does raise another interesting aspect to all of this, because in addition to wanting to study people with Parkinson's, there's of course a whole lot of complementary interest in people who are at risk either by virtue of a known genetic cause or some other clinical features that are commonly associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's. And I think right now that's not a major part of the registry, but that could be a very important application of this type of program moving forward.
Great, thank you.
So in the past, it has happened that people have solicited this type of network to do studies on caregivers.
Okay.
And while initially they're not, we don't take all the information down, when they do, when those studies do, we give them the name of the patients and to contact them, and then they will do the effort to ask the caregivers to take part in the studies.
That's great, thank you. One of the things we heard a little bit about was obviously this is going to provide the opportunity for more collaboration with the researchers, the clinicians, and people impacted by Parkinson's here in Canada. But we know research is not just in one location. It's a global effort. So I would love to understand, are there potentials for C-OPN to collaborate with other researchers and clinicians outside of Canada? And if you could potentially speak about that a little bit, Ted.
So absolutely. I think that Canada is on the global scale is not a big country, as we all know, but we have a long history of collaborating and working together, which has I think often we punch above our weight in that sense. And one of the things that we've really been championing, and you notice that it's called Open, Canadian Open Parkinson Network, because we are very much committed to the data being part of an open science initiative. So the idea is that data is available to researchers around the world, and we are actively interested in collaborating. There are other initiatives in various countries, including the US and in Europe, where there are similar kinds of cohorts and databases, often with subtly or slightly different emphasis depending on the project. Some have a more genetic emphasis, others have more imaging emphasis, etc. So I think that we are actively collaborating. All of us, Oury, Jon, myself, have active collaborations with people that are leading these networks, and we are definitely involved and interested and are pushing this to be part of more global. I mean, even if we had, become wildly successful, we still want to have, networks. What ideally you'd want are networks of networks, and to have the kind of power, statistical power, to answer some of the really hard questions. So the answer is yes, and I think that the O in the C-OPN is a very important component. I think that may be somewhat unique to Canada and to our initiative, and I think that the goal of that is that we want science to advance. I mean, there's certain things that we can, even if we collect all this data on that, Jon, Oury, and I, and all our colleagues in Canada do work with, let's say, data sets of imaging or data sets of stem cells that that iPSCs that we're looking at. There are still, I'm sure, many questions that we won't think of, or that even if we do think of, don't have the expertise to address. So having someone in Singapore or in Germany, access that data and say, let's see what we can do with it, and maybe there's something that can come out of this, I think is incredibly powerful, and it's incredibly important. I think someone, with Parkinson's doesn't really care if the answer comes from Vancouver or Montreal or Calgary. They want an answer, and that's what we're working towards.
I just pick up on a couple of things there, Karen, that Ted has talked about. So first of all, I would like to emphasize that despite our small population, Canada has historically been a major contributor to Parkinson's research for many years. But it also brings forward a responsibility that we have to participate as one of the more privileged nations in the world. We do have an obligation to participate in a more global effort. The other thing is that that while it's important to look at the commonalities, it's equally important to look at the differences, and Oury referred to that earlier as the heterogeneity, Ted as when he was talking about the personalized medicine, and I referred to it with different terminology. But it's really important if you're looking, say, at genetic factors or an interaction between genetic and environmental factors and other outcomes. These may be different between different ethnic groups and people who are living in different environments. So it's actually critically important that those data be shared so that people can understand what those contributions are. Unfortunately, one of the challenges, I think most of us are quite committed to the concept of data sharing.
Yeah.
But there are challenges in terms of privacy legislation, and people need to understand that. Ted, I think, is the only one on the call who's really committed to Tinder, and so he would require the privacy protection. But and so with the White House. But you know, this is actually a constraint in terms of sharing data, and it's been challenging enough historically to share across the country, and certainly once you start moving across international borders, that becomes an even bigger challenge.
For sure. And yeah, go ahead, Oury.
No, I just wanted to say that indeed a lot of what we do behind the scene is sorting out all these agreements so we can share this data.
Well, and I think this is where organizations such as Parkinson Canada, other charities that fund research, it's a critical part in terms of, you know, helping people understand what privacy means, and where we can, we'd like to assist so that research can move forward. And that's really where we see the role of Parkinson Canada in some of those places as well. We are almost heading near the end of our discussion. I want to leave room for some Q&A as well. So for those of you who are on the call who have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box and we will try to address them. But I am going to ask a potentially larger question to our three panelists. As we talked about, you know, C-OPN's providing a lot of opportunity to collaborate, not only here in Canada, but worldwide. I'd love to hear from each of you. What are you most hopeful for in the future for Parkinson's research? So I will start with Ted first, if that's okay.
Well, I mean, as I said, I'm gonna spin this in a bit of a strange way, okay?
Okay.
If you had in the 1970s and 80s, if you had lung cancer, then, you know, basically you got chemotherapy and radiation therapy and everyone got the same treatment. Lung cancer was lung cancer. And I think that's where Parkinson's is today, where if you have Parkinson's, maybe not, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I think that's sort of the concept today. Now, in 2020, if you have lung cancer, what happens is you get a biopsy and scientists will look at the genome of that tumor, at the transcriptome, so at the genes that are being expressed by that tumor. They can grow the tumor cells in the lab and they can try different medications on the tumor. And some people now don't even get chemo anymore. They get, you know, very, very specific drugs that will just melt away their cancer. And I think, you know, it's not exactly the same, but I think that one of the reasons that we have not been able to do this in Parkinson's or other brain diseases is that people that have Parkinson's, you can't go in and get a chunk of their brain while they're still alive. And so there's no way to study that. We've been stuck with doing these kinds of analyses in mice and in laboratory cells that are artificial. So I'm very hopeful that the ability now to take actual patient cells and grow them into brain models will be transformative in the way that the kind of personalized approach has been in cancer, where you now have very, very specific drugs, and sometimes you don't even need the more general drugs based on the patient's cells. And so for me, this is really where I think your question is, what are you most hopeful for? And I think that, to me, is really where I see enormous possibility. I think we're really just at the dawn of this era. There's still very, very much to do, and the technology to do it is still in its infancy. But I think that within the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be able to do this kind of screening in patient cells and provide treatments that are targeted towards individual patients.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to Oury. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. It's a bit of a continuation to what Dr. Faun has said. I think, so we've realized in the last 20, 30 years that there's a whole scope of symptoms that are both motor and non-motor. I think what I'm looking forward to is the fact that with these types of data and research going on, we'll understand much better how they interact with each other. And the fact that we'll be able to now address, we'll be able to address the various symptoms, not just the motor symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And with the methods that Dr. Faun is talking about, we'll be closer to have treatments that are possibly closer to the root of the problem as opposed to just the symptoms. But I think it has to be done together. You can't just do one versus the other. I think it has to be the symptoms as a whole and trying to get to the origin of the disease and its treatment.
Excellent, thank you. Jon, can you talk about what you think was the most hopeful piece for the future of Parkinson's research?
Well, so Ted's talked about the Holy Grail, and I'll be a little bit more modest in my expectations. Of course, everybody wants a world without Parkinson's, and Ted is really talking about whether we can learn enough to create such a world, or that if people have Parkinson's, that we can really have an impact on the underlying disease process. That is absolutely the ideal long-term goal, but it's also a very challenging one. And I think in the meantime, we need to think about, can we make a world with Parkinson's a better place, a more manageable place? And that may mean in terms of managing some of the non-motor symptoms that Oury is talking about, but also in terms of understanding how our brains compensate. When we have a disease like Parkinson's, there are mechanisms that are only very incompletely understood that may help delay the progression, that may explain why some people get certain complications and others do not. And I think you talked before about the benefits of people participating in this. This is one of the reasons I'm so committed to WPC, is because it's not a question of having the scientists lined up on one side of the room and the patients on the other side of the room. This always has to be a partnered approach, and engagement in this type of activity has great benefits for people who participate. There's plenty of data showing that, but it's also working together to find a kind of common set of questions and common set of solutions. And I think you can only do that when you pool the information.
That's great. Thank you, Jon. We have a couple of questions now from the audience. And once again, for those of you, if you have any, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll try to address them. One specifically talks about, we talk about the importance of data collection, right? And right now in Parkinson's, the evaluation of somebody having Parkinson's is mainly one done by the eye, right? And so curious from the audience was, are there any devices that are capable of collecting something in a more objective way and probably similar across all the centers? Or is this something that is being developed right now? Anyone want to take that?
Well, this is particularly important. This was particularly has moved forward because of COVID as well, because it has had implications. But I'll let my clinicians colleagues answer that. So.
Well, I mean, I think what you're talking about is probably wearable sensors, which is indeed part of the C-OPN and many other initiatives. This has become a very hot area. But it's important to remember that the wearables may give you an objective readout of motor function, but they do not replace a diagnosis. So we're really talking about two different things.
Yeah. And I think that's a key piece going forward. Probably that could be a whole other discussion when we talk about technology and wearables in terms of, you know, it probably at this time is not a diagnosis. It's just really to get a sense of where you are at that moment in time, right? Not this is where you have this. And I think that's a really critical piece, right?
And also to appreciate that when we see people in a clinic visit, we get a tiny little snapshot of what their overall life is like. Right. And the wearables allow you to collect far more information and hopefully to condense all that information into something that's digestible.
Okay.
But also, sorry.
No, go ahead, Ted.
I was just going to say, but to tell you where you're at, but also perhaps, you know, importantly to aid in the stratification and the subtyping. I mean, those are things we cannot know beforehand. I mean, but again, with large numbers, patterns in the wearables may emerge that point towards subgroups and various, you know, subtypes of Parkinson's through. So that approach, I think, is potentially very powerful, but still also in its infancy. I don't think today we have, you know, a good concept of whether or how that could be achieved yet.
Right.
And it's not either or, right? So Oury referred to the tangentially to the application of telehealth. Yep. So on the one hand, I've been seeing patients by Zoom for the last, you know, 4.5 months now. And on the one hand, you can't always extract the same information that you would in person. On the other hand, it actually gives very different insights because I'm seeing people in their home. I'm seeing if they're living in a tight, cramped space, if they have clutter all over the floor, if they've got a nice wide open space and a lot of support around them. It gives me a totally different insight from what I would normally get in a clinic visit.
Wow, interesting. I'm going to go now to a more I would say a more scientific question in the sense of, I have a question here is, what do you think are the most likely biomarkers that might emerge from this kind of study?
I guess we're all going to answer that, but I'll just say it depends on what the scientists ask. So okay. If you collect the samples, then you can decide later what you're going to do. Now, you may have to decide what kind of sample to collect and what, you know, how it's processed. I can see the rest of the question, and yeah, there is great interest in collecting samples other than just blood. There are already consortia in Canada and elsewhere, including our center, that are interested, for instance, in microbiome samples.
Right, great. Any other, Oury or Ted, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think that, so thank you, Ben, for that question. It's a really great question. I think that there's really no way to know in advance, I mean, which biomarkers will emerge. I think that's the whole point of doing these kinds of studies on scale, is that you have the power then to ask those kinds of questions. I mean, a great example is this study that was just published on distinguishing Alzheimer's disease from other dementias with tau, and from a simple blood test with phospho-tau. And I think if you'd asked someone, you know, 2-3 years ago, you know, which biomarker is it going to be? Tau, is it going to be something else? I mean, tau would have been a reasonable bet, but I don't think we could have said in advance. So I think that's the whole goal of doing these studies. And as Jon said, I mean, the network, the C-OPN, is there to support research and at some levels to actually do some of the research, but it's really more to support other scientists across the country and provide them with the infrastructure. So, you know, we are probably not going to be the ones who are going to be doing those studies. We're going to be able to provide people who are experts in, you know, alpha-synuclein or LRRK or so on, who will measure these things in blood or in skin or in iPSCs, and those people will be funded by their own research labs. What we do is we provide the material and the resource, and the patients provide actually the material and resources. So, and I can also read the second part of that question, transcriptomic metabolomics. So exactly, I mean, I think those things are very, very interesting. I don't think that this C-OPN is funded to actually do those experiments. But imagine if we could provide mini brains of, you know, hundreds of patients to a lab that has expertise in metabolomics, they could do it on those, and they could not have those samples otherwise. So this is where the collaboration goes. It goes both, you know, horizontally across Parkinson's, but also vertically across different expertises.
Great. And I know there's quite a few more, but in the sense of there's a lot about collaboration. I think the idea is over time, and currently we're looking to build linkages, whether it's in Ontario with Michael J. Fox Foundation and other cohorts, because we recognize the importance of collaboration. Eli will actually send more information out after this call for everyone who has asked. But I really we actually are heading up to our hour. This goes fast when you have these great panelists with you and having fascinating discussions. But I do want to thank Dr. Stoessl, Dr. Monchi, and Dr. Faun for joining us today and sharing the excitement, the promise of C-OPN and what it can do in terms of accelerating research and impacting the lives of people who are living with Parkinson's. I'm going to turn it back to Eli from the World Parkinson Coalition, and she will just say a few final words.
Thank you, Karen. And wow, this is really great. You're absolutely right. It's never enough time once you get going. I do hope, not to put any pressure on you, but I hope that in a few years we can have maybe the same panelists and you back, Karen, and you can give us an update on what you've been able to find out and learn. So John, you're not allowed to retire until we get some data out of this, okay?
I anticipate having been assassinated long before that occurs.
No, we won't let that happen. We need to get something good with this. This has been really exciting. I think not only the opportunity just to hear from Parkinson Canada, but to see how many people are interested. We had almost 100 people on today, another 100 and I think 20 registered. So clearly there's interest. Almost everyone registered is from Canada, but of course across the globe as well. So first of all, thank you to everybody for joining us today. As a reminder, this panel, and I'm sorry I didn't say it at the beginning, this panel is being recorded. So if you'd like to go back to it or you'd like to recommend someone else watch it, we'll make sure in our email follow-up to all of you, you know how to find that recording, and encourage you to certainly share it with anyone else you think would be interested. And thank you, of course, to our panelists, Dr. Stoessl, Faun, and Manchi. It was wonderful to have you. I know how busy you are, so it's great to get some time of your day. And of course to Parkinson Canada, and it was wonderful. Thanks. And thanks to Parkinson Canada and Karen for moderating this. I know Karen is new to the position. She's learning fast and furious about Parkinson's in the community. I'm really impressed with this C-OPN. It is exciting. You know, there's a saying, you know, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. I was thinking about this. What happens with C-OPN is not going to stay in Canada. What's exciting about it is that if you accelerate research in Canada, everyone in the world is going to benefit from it. So obviously that matters to our global community. So I'm excited to be able to watch this grow and see the outcomes and share it with the global community. So again, we'll send you an email reminder filling you in on how you can either sign up for C-OPN, get more information, or watch this talk again. And I want to just thank everyone again for coming to join us and hope you have a wonderful remainder of your day.
Thanks all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks for the invitation.
Bye.